Good day, Thomas Jefferson Hour podcast listeners. This week, we speak to President Jefferson. It's been a while, and it was just delightful. I must say, before Clay begins to talk about this week's show, I want to thank everybody who listens and takes the time to listen. We appreciate that. And also, thank you so much for supporting the show, those of you who choose to do so in whatever way you wish. You can go to jeffersonhour.com, click on donate, or you can just go to jeffersonhour.com and send us a letter and tell us what you think of the show, ask Jefferson or Clay a question. And with that, sir, thanks for being Jefferson this week.
It's fun to suit up. We've been increasingly doing Listening to America and one-on-one and conversations with Lindsay Chervinsky and conversations with our dear friend Joe, the great author of Vermont. And so getting Jefferson in character with his wig and his tights on is rarer than it once was. It's fun to take listener questions because we don't rehearse, which maybe is obvious, but
you don't need to rehearse. I mean, like I said, it's like turning on the faucet and out it comes. But I have to thank you because we were in a sort of a groove in years past where I would talk with President Jefferson at least a couple of times a month.
3, I'd say, yeah.
It has an effect on me, and I've missed it. It was great to talk to him, and with your permission, I'd like to talk to him next week, particularly about a couple of subjects, and that one of them would be Christian nationalism. I'd really be interested to hear what Jefferson has to say about that. So will you do it again next week?
Of course, and in this program, we tried in a brief compass to talk about why slavery has to be a conversation on the Thomas Jefferson Hour, but why it cannot be allowed to be the only conversation on the Thomas Jefferson Hour. That's a really tough tightrope. I almost said minefield. I feel we have a responsibility to address this question because this is that moment in American historiography when these questions are central, and they've damaged Jefferson and damaged other figures in our history, and rightly so. But so this moment can't be ducked. The Black Lives Matter movement and the talk of white fragility and caste and white rage and so on. These things this is that moment, and serious civilizations don't duck their moment. And and here's the important thing, David, we can address this moment. It's not easy, it's not fun, it's often excruciating, but think of what's going on in Russia right now. So Putin has called up 300,000 or more new people. There's widespread agony in Russia. They've lost maybe 75,000 troops, maybe more, and a huge amount of their war materiel. There's no discussion. It's all in private houses, huddled under candlelight. There's no public discussion of such a thing. In the U.S., imagine the debate we would be having if this were our war. That's what a democracy does. It's messy. It's icky. It makes for sleepless nights. It's excruciating. We turn away in escapism in some respects. But the fact is, the great societies talk about the issues that have to be talked about. And the issue for our time in the United States is the unfinished, unresolved race question at the core of American life. And I know lots of people that I really respect that are just turned off by this and say, is this all we get to talk about now? And I feel that in some moods. But the fact is, this happened. A series of things brought this to the fore, and we have to talk about it. And not talking about it, as we have been very successful at doing in the past, means that it just compounds itself, alas. And Jefferson, of course, is a central figure in any conversation about this in a way that, say, Franklin Roosevelt is not, or John Kennedy is not. They're both part of the race conversation. They're not central to it, but Jefferson is. And so that's a burden. It's also an opportunity. And my goal is to keep it in balance because, for example, I just had this conversation the other day, David. People going to Monticello now, some of them are saying, it's too much. It's in your face. It's just too much race, too much Sally Hemings, too much slave quarters, too much this. That the fun of going to see America's first Disney World, Jefferson's Monticello, has been diminished for some people by the bombardment of the race question. And I understand both sides of that question, believe me. So we struggle with this. But when this started, because you said we get these letters from new listeners who say, aren't you ever going to address the problem of slavery? And I think, that's all we address. I mean, almost no program goes by without slavery being part of it.
Got to thank some of the listeners whose questions we answered this week. Reed Schuler, Rights versus Responsibilities, and also Lois Riggins, the 72-year-old who wrote that great note to us. And let's keep this short. I know you have things to do, and get to the show.
Indeed. Thanks, everyone, for listening. Let's go to the program. This one is Listener Questions to the third President of the United States, beginning with abundance in agriculture and ending with banned books. Thanks for listening. Let's go to the show.
Good day, citizens, and welcome to the Thomas Jefferson Hour. This week, a conversation with President Thomas Jefferson. Mr. Jefferson is portrayed by the award-winning humanities scholar and author, Clay Jenkinson. I'm your host, David Swenson, and seated across from me is President Thomas Jefferson. Mr. Jefferson, we haven't spoken for quite a while. It's so good to see you, sir.
Good day to you, citizen.
Mr. Jefferson, I was out in my small patch of earth I call a garden the other day and thinking of you and wondering what sort of end-of-the-season preparations you are making at Monticello in your gardens.
Well, of course, the ice ran out in late summer. We try to keep ice through the year, but it's very difficult to do, and such ice as remains in the ice house is no longer very palatable. We smoke meat. We slaughter animals and smoke their meats and sometimes dry it. We have root cellars where we can put potatoes and other things, but preservation of garden food is extremely difficult in my time. And so it creates a problem. Fortunately, we can grow garden vegetables about 8.5 or 9 months per year, sometimes even a little bit longer at Monticello. But drying, smoking are the essential methods of preservation, and that always reduces the flavor of these foods. But we have very little choice. So, we wrap up the garden, we take out those things which won't survive a freeze, and continue to grow lettuce and anything else that might still grow as the waning light of the autumn continues.
Preservation of food must have been a huge part of the tasks of your gardens.
Well, we had ice houses, but they're very inconvenient. So workers, by which I mean enslaved people, had to go down into the Shadwell, the creek, or ponds, and cut out large blocks of ice, which in itself is a very laborsome and tedious business, and then haul them by wagon up to the house where there was a pit, an ice cellar, and there they would use burlap and straw to pack this in such a way that it would have an insulation effect, and assume that the constant temperature there, which would be 50-some degrees, coupled with that insulating material, would keep the ice relatively intact through much of the winter. But compared to your technologies, it's almost infinitely more laborsome.
I know, sir, that you have always wished Americans to be self-dependent, to grow their own food when they can. And we got a letter from Mr. Adam Hoffman I wanted to share with you. He writes, I was driving through the farmland of Delaware, where I live, and I saw field after field of corn, wheat, barley, and soybeans. The mid-Atlantic countryside, what is left of it, is just beautiful this time of year, just before harvest time. You really get to see how bountiful this land can be. And he says, the small farmer is still alive and well here. And I thought you would enjoy that, sir.
Indeed. The soybeans were not something that we grew in my time. But those other grains, of course, it's the miracle of agriculture that planting X grains of wheat will produce X times 100. that this is what agriculture is about. It's where the real wealth of the world is produced. When a banker makes a loan, there's a financial profit, but there's no wealth produced. I'm a student of the economic school known as physiocracy, a French school, and it argues that all wealth comes from the earth, either in minerals that we mine or in agricultural products or trees or other productions of the earth. And those who cooperate with those natural rhythms, those natural laws, are the choicest of all of our citizens. And so the farmer, I said, is the chosen person of God because he is working with the fertility of the earth to multiply wealth and then share it with the rest of the community. Whereas the stock jobber, the speculator, does no real work. He's just exploiting capital on his own behalf. And I understand that's how capitalism works, but it doesn't actually produce wealth, and it certainly doesn't produce moral happiness.
Mr. Hoffman also has a question for you, sir. He wants you to talk about the whiskey tax and the rebellion that ensued on the frontier. He wants to know if you were in favor of such a direct tax from the federal government while you were a member of Washington's cabinet.
Now, this was Colonel Hamilton at work, so I'll give the briefest explanation I can. Of course, the government needed tax revenue. Some of it came from land sales in the West, and some came from tariffs at the Atlantic Ocean at port. But in order to get enough tax revenue to bring down the national debt, Hamilton devised the whiskey tax, which he regarded as a sort of sin tax or luxury tax. And whiskey coming over from the Trans-Appalachian region to the population centers like Pittsburgh or Philadelphia or Boston would be taxed by the federal government. Well, the farmers who were doing this objected, and they were right to object because they felt they were being singled out. They couldn't transport their grain easily to market because they had to get it across the Appalachian Mountains, and so they distilled it instead into whiskey, which is much more portable and doesn't deteriorate, and they carried that whiskey across the mountains and sold it to willing buyers. They felt that this was an agricultural practice that made good sense given the lack of roads and infrastructure of our time, and that for Mr. Hamilton to single them out as opposed to someone who was growing oats or growing potatoes or growing cucumbers was a discriminatory tax. And so they asked for relief. They believed that the First Amendment gave them the right to petition for redress of grievances. Hamilton and his minions were unmoved by this, and they began to enforce this very divisive whiskey tax. And so finally, when they couldn't get any relief, the farmers of western Pennsylvania, and to a certain degree other states, including Virginia, rose up and stopped the collection of such taxes. This was a rebellion. It's called the Whiskey Rebellion. It began in 1794. I did not have the same level of commentary on this that I had on Shays' Rebellion of 1786, where I said I like a little rebellion now and then. But I generally supported the whiskey farmers because they were right that they were being discriminated against. The thing about a tax is that it must affect everyone equally and not single out one sector of the economy for special burdening. And if Hamilton had understood agriculture, or if he'd understood the spirit of our Western people, he probably would not have done it.
Mr. Hoffman also asks if you had heated disputes with Mr. Hamilton's. It sounds as if you did.
It was later said that we fought like two cocks in the cabinet of George Washington, as if this were, a cockfight. That's not really true because both of us were gentlemen, so there was no shouting, there was no finger pointing or open accusation. We were gentlemen. But we did have strenuous disagreements, and Hamilton talked for victory. His concern was always to prevail. He was more interested in his own ambition and his own political success as the favorite son of George Washington than I think he was of Commonwealth interests. So I was always at a disadvantage in these conversations because I am the more polite of the two, more averse to conflict of the two, more likely to try to persuade than to bully. And Hamilton, frankly, had a closer relationship with the president at this time than I did. And so he almost always prevailed. And I felt that his ideas were simply the wrong ones. He tilted towards Britain. He wanted a large central government. He wanted a large peacetime establishment of an army. He was in favor of a significant national debt. He wanted to favor industry over agriculture. He was not particularly committed to helping our western territories and western states thrive. He was a broad constructionist of the Constitution, and I'm a strict constructionist. And so in almost every way, Colonel Hamilton was arguing for an America that I didn't want to live in. It was an America that looked like a kind of New England, but with a homegrown elite led by Colonel Hamilton as its prime minister. And I thought that the revolution, which had been fought with such pain and blood and treachery, gave us a chance to start civilization over again on a new, more rational footing. And I couldn't understand why this gifted man, and he certainly was a tremendously gifted individual, why he would give his mighty energies to creating a British-like, top-down American mercantile government and economic system. It seemed to me to be such a poverty of imagination. So we were pitted against each other. I almost always disagreed with him. He almost always prevailed.
So to conclude your answer to this question from Mr. Adam Hoffman, sir, it wasn't that you were opposed to taxes, it was that you were opposed to this sort of direct tax. Am I correct?
I'm not opposed to taxes. Obviously, we need to keep them as small as possible because we don't want to take out of the pockets of our people the bread they have earned. This is their money. They earned it by hard labor. Most labor was difficult, backbreaking, life-shortening. And so to take people's money for schools or bridges or whatever it might be is important. But those who are doing this need to be deeply respectful of the work that's being done by these people to put food on the table for themselves and their families. And if there are taxes, then they need to be fair taxes. They need to affect every sector of the economy equally. And they mustn't single out a sector for special burdening. It just seems to me axiomatic that you wouldn't do this. But I think the mistake Hamilton made was that he thought he was producing a really clever sin tax. People love whiskey and tobacco, therefore you can tax them more or less as you please. He didn't realize that this was the way farmers west of the Appalachians were able to survive, but that is to transfer their grains into grain alcohol and transport that to market. And if Hamilton had understood that, he might not have changed his policies, but at least he would have been more aware of why the Whiskey Rebellion occurred.
Very good, sir. We're going to take a short break. We'll return in just a moment. You're listening to the Thomas Jefferson Hour. Welcome back to the Thomas Jefferson Hour, your weekly conversation with President Thomas Jefferson. And welcome back to you, Mr. Jefferson.
It's good to be here, sir.
Sir, if I might, I'd like to ask you a question of somewhat of a personal nature. And that is, what are you reading these days, sir?
Oh, my. I read a good deal. I wouldn't say I read a book a day, but I have a very large library. And I'm mostly interested in two subjects, mathematics, which may sound strange, but I'm a Baconian. I believe that if we measure the world and gather data, that this will invariably lead us down the right path in terms of social policy. So mathematics matter to me not per se, although they're beautiful in their simplicity, but as a way of measuring everything for social amelioration. So there's that. And the other subject is ancient classics. So there are two types of ancient classics, really. Historical works, which I devour because they tell us what other Western civilizations have done or tried to do, And more importantly, they tell us what can go wrong in a society, particularly the Roman Republic, that died in the era of Julius and Augustus Caesar. So I read ancient history as a way of peering into a mirror, a sort of somewhat distorted mirror, but a mirror nevertheless that can help us set wise social policy in our time. And I also read literary classics, so the Odes of Horace, the greatest of all the Roman literary poets, or Ovid. Everyone knows he wrote the Metamorphoses, or the satires of Juvenal, maybe occasionally the erotic poems of Catullus, but in Greek literature, of course, the Iliad and the Odyssey, which, by the way, it's worth learning Greek, ancient Greek, to do. It's a struggle to learn ancient Greek. I did it when I was a young man, but it's worth learning ancient Greek to read those two immortal epics in the original. And their counterpart in Rome is Virgil's Aeneid, which is another of the greatest works of Western civilization. I occasionally will turn to ancient philosophy, but I find Plato to be tedious and spend very little time trying to sort out his whimsies. As to modern literature, I don't read novels. I regard that as the scandalous stuff that women who are bored with life read to help themselves go to sleep. So I don't read novels much, a handful of them, I suppose. I've read my Shakespeare. I certainly have read all the modern poets from Chaucer through Samuel Johnson and Alexander Pope. But when I am happiest, I'm reading a book either of political economy, someone like Montesquieu, whose Spirit of the Laws was almost a recipe book for our Constitution, or I'm reading mathematics or Greek and Roman classics.
I sure enjoy reading history and contemporary history. I don't know if there would be such a thing during your time.
Oh, yes, there was. Not very good. And many people came to me as they were writing a history of the Revolution or a history of the Declaration of Independence, and either asked me to sit for an interview or wanted me to write out an account by letter. What happened was that the great John Marshall, whom you remember as the first great Chief Justice of the Supreme Court, my cousin, by the way, he wrote a 5-volume biography of George Washington. John Adams called it a mausoleum. It was what's known as hagiography. It was a saint's life. Washington could do no wrong. It was a flattering, obsessive, appallingly favorable biography of George Washington, which was very hard on all of Washington's opponents, including at times me. And so I was afraid that Marshall's 5-volume biography of Washington would lay the groundwork for all subsequent histories of the American Revolution, and this would be a wild distortion. So I did two things. I collected conversations, gossip, private notes that I had written through all this period into a kind of a collection called the Honest, which was just a series of memories of conversations that occurred during these key months and years. And I didn't publish that, but I left it for historians to discover. And I also then encouraged small r Republican historians like William Wirt to write a counter history of the Revolution that would not be so slavish in its praise of the Federalists and particularly of George Washington. I loved Washington, don't get me wrong, but he was a man like other men, and to make him a god on earth and to vilify all of his adversaries was an act that was deeply offensive to me by my cousin John Marshall. So there were contemporary historians. Mercy Otis Warren wrote a history of the Revolution that so upset John Adams, because she did not make him the hero of it, that they wound up having an epistolary argument, a fight that lasted several years. And you can imagine how many letters he wrote to her, challenging almost every one of her statements about the details of the American Revolution and demanding that she rewrite portions of it to do more respect to him.
Sir, I'm curious to know, during your time, were there books that were banned, that were taken out of public circulation in order to prevent citizens from reading them?
I can't think of any, not in the United States. But in Europe, there was still a great deal of this. The Inquisition continued to exist. The Index of Prohibited Books of the papacy continued to exist. And so Catholic Europeans were forbidden to read certain sorts of books, and in some instances they were burned. There were licensing procedures in Paris and in London for the presses. And although they were loosening in my time, people had to get a license to publish a book. And that meant that the censor wasn't necessarily hostile, was going to look over that manuscript before it was published. I know Voltaire, as a young man, he's a generation older than I was, and I never met him, unfortunately. But when he was a young man, he wrote some satirical squibs about such and such an aristocrat, and a short time later he was hauled out of a restaurant and beaten nearly to death by thugs in the employ of that French aristocrat. So freedom of expression was an ideal of the Enlightenment, and it was mostly realized in America, where very little of this occurred. Sometimes there was controversy, but there was not censorship or public violence. But in Europe, it still existed in our time, which is one of the reasons that people need to remember how important the invention of America is, that Europe could conceive of these ideals, that someone could publish what he pleased, that someone could worship the God of his choice, that people could petition their government for redress of grievances, that people should not be put into prison and the key thrown away, that there should be habeas corpus. These principles of the Enlightenment were very unevenly rooted in European life, and they were more practiced in the breach than in the inclusion. In the United States, in this our happy republic, those ideals found fertile ground and took root and became the standards of civilization for the entire world, certainly for Europe. And I think Americans in your time sometimes forget what a revolutionary new start this was for human society, and that the United States was the place where Enlightenment ideals were able to spread themselves and prove their efficacy. This is extremely important. And your question about censorship reminds me that in Europe, people had to look over their shoulders before they gave something to the press. That was not the case in the New World.
Mr. Jefferson, it would be safe to say that you would oppose banning books, even if the ideas were ones you strongly disagreed with. Am I correct?
Yes, in the preamble to the Virginia Statute for Religious Liberty, which was published in 1786, I say that the truth is great and will prevail when left to itself, that that when government gets involved in the free exchange of ideas, it inevitably distorts that process, and that the only ideas that need government support are bad ones, that in a fair contest, truth will win over falsehood, that good sense will win over nonsense, and that we need to be confident that the truth is more potent in the long run than anything that is untruth or superstitious or conspiracy. So I believe very strongly that this trial must be made. Look, I suffered. You know that I was accused of being an atheist all of my life, which is not at all true. That I was accused of being a dangerous Jacobin, that my principles were too radical, that I'd been Frenchified, that I had stayed in France too long, that I was not reliable in some sense of order and protection of property. I was accused of being a Democrat, that I championed the rights of white men without property base and so on. And there were personal scandal mongers who attacked my private life, as you know. And so, of course, I would have loved to shut down those presses and prosecute those ruffians people who didn't know me, who had no idea who I was, but nevertheless wrote scurrilous attacks on my life and character and damaged the serenity of my children and grandchildren and my closest friends. Of course, I would have liked to stop them. Everyone wants to shut down that kind of abuse, but to do so is to enter a kind of road to authoritarianism. And the question I always ask is, who gets to decide? Do I get to decide what gets published? Does George Washington get to decide? Does Benedict Arnold get to decide? Does Aaron Burr get to decide? This is a power that can be very easily abused by anybody who embraces it. And so the best thing for us to do, and believe me, it was agonizingly hard, is to withdraw, say nothing, and assume that the public will sort out these vicious attacks that are made in the press from time to time, and largely that was the case.
There is a minority of Americans now who support banning certain books, but they're very vocal. And primarily they're concerned about ideas presented to their children. How do you respond to that?
Well, I do think that's a particular problem. I had 2 children who lived to be adults. I educated them myself. They were my daughters. You would say I homeschooled them, but it wasn't really like that. I had previously been tutored by Scots Anglican clergymen in the neighborhood of my boyhood home at Shadwell. So I had some formal schooling, but it wasn't public school. These were just small, private, informal academies that clergymen would operate during their free time. So there was no public education system, and so it was simpler then. But if I wanted to educate my children, I would put in front of them books that I thought would help them form their adult character. I wouldn't put books in front of them that were scandalous or salacious or vicious or that espoused totalitarianism, for example. So I would be shaping the curriculum as a homeschooling parent. But when you have children come together into a school, and so 10 families hire a tutor, now they have to collectively decide what shall be taught and what shall not be taught. And I don't think that the parents should simply say to the tutor, you know better than we do, go ahead, educate our children, we'll stay out of it. That would be a dereliction of duty, and family is exceedingly important as its own sovereignty. So I think in a case like this, parents do have a role to say, I pay taxes, my children go to school, I don't want them exposed to X. Now, that can be an open debate, and it can be a civil debate, and many times parents are wrong, but they should be persuaded, not vetoed. So this is a very significant problem, because nothing is more sacred than family, and nothing is more important than the education of our children. And I don't think that parents should be supine and just say, well, whatever the experts in the education decide is the right thing for our children, I guess we'll just swallow it. I think parents should be loud, should get good information.
Well, what you're saying, sir, is that parents have a responsibility. And there's a question that I'd like to present to you from Reed Schuler. He says, why does Jefferson have such a concern over a citizen's rights rather than their responsibilities?
Well, I think responsibilities are, of course, important. You serve in some functions in your community, justice of the peace, or you serve on a jury, or you join the militia during a dangerous time. Of course, we have responsibilities to voluntarily pay our taxes, to abide by the laws of property and not steal each other's hogs and apples and chickens. Everyone who is in a polity, is in a social compact, understands rights and responsibilities. But I'm going to emphasize rights, and here's why. For the history of the planet, in all of the records we have, average human beings have been ground down to powder by aristocrats and clergymen and kings and so on. They have been abused, starved, beaten, forced to fight frivolous wars. The history of the world is the history of oppression of average people. And it's not until you come along in Britain to the Magna Carta, which was a very preliminary and aristocratic declaration of rights, and move towards greater and greater state restraint in these ways, until we get to something like the Declaration of Independence and the Bill of Rights in the United States, which isn't the final word on the subject, but is very much closer to a final understanding of what rights we have by birth alone. By the accident of our birth, we are entitled to certain rights, and the state must not intrude. That's why I emphasize this. If the history of the world were the history of rights but weak responsibilities, I would take the other side. But the history of the world is oppression, and the rights of man had to be asserted at the end of a musket, at the end of a pitchfork, at the end of a torch. The people in power don't give up their power happily. Remember, they had to cut King Louis XVI's head off before they could form a French Republic, and a similar thing happened in Britain in 1649 with Charles I. So I emphasize rights because they're the things that get abused and eliminated by ambitious men. And most people, and I certainly feel this in the United States that I presided over, are quite eager to show their social responsibilities. That they voluntarily obey laws, they voluntarily show up for jury duty, etc. And so I don't think that that's, in my time, that was in any significant danger.
Very good, Mr. Jefferson. I thank you for this conversation. It's been a while since we've talked, and I've enjoyed this very much. I so appreciate you sharing your insights and your experience, sir.
Well, thank you, citizen.
We're going to take a short break, but when we return, we'll be speaking with the creator of the Thomas Jefferson Hour, the man who portrays President Jefferson when he's here, Mr. Clay Jenkinson. We'll be back in just a moment. You're listening to the Thomas Jefferson Hour. Welcome back to the Thomas Jefferson Hour, and now we shall welcome the creator of the Thomas Jefferson Hour, Mr. Clay Jenkinson. And it was so much fun to talk with Mr. Jefferson this week. Clay, thanks for that.
Thank you, David, my friend, my dear friend, and the semi-permanent guest host of the Thomas Jefferson Hour. It's always a pleasure to have a conversation with you, and I'm in a kind of a funny mood today. So less oratorical and more kind of just trying to figure out, well, how would Jefferson see that? What would Jefferson's response to that be in plain English? And so that's fun. It's fun to channel this stuff. It's weird. I've been reading Jefferson's letters again, and there are thousands and thousands of them, and they're magnificent letters. And reading, and you think, what an extraordinary man who, in one moment he's writing about currency in Europe, which he doesn't really understand, and then he's making lists of books for friends back in the United States, and then he's talking about flora and fauna and the mammoth and the mastodon and paleontology, and then he's talking about affairs in Europe and whether the United States will be able to get any of its model economic treaties accepted by Prussia or Portugal or the pirates of the Mediterranean. And then he's talking about agricultural practices back in Virginia and library classification systems and his desire to see more balloon rides in Paris, and maybe the balloon can be made a technology of transportation in the United States, and what's going on in chemistry, what's going on in mineralogy, where he can get the most inexpensive copies of Greek and Roman classics, how to get books bound the way you want them when you're in a foreign country. And you just think, wow, this is not Gerald Ford. This is not Grover Cleveland. This is a man of just extraordinary breadth and curiosity and purposefulness and earnestness. And it's, we take it for granted. You and I sit here and do this thing. I know you feel it too. It comes in waves, but I feel the wave of admiration for such a man, and that you and I get to play him together. We get to play Jefferson. It's what,
Yeah. How many Americans get to sit around and talk to a dead president? Well, I'm one of them. I should say, though, for new listeners to the Jefferson Hour, and we get new listeners all the time, and we get correspondence from the question is, well, what about slavery? What about all those awful things Jefferson did? And believe me, if you are a new listener, that is something we deal with and quite a lot. However, I have found from previous experience that if I go head on to Mr. Jefferson when you're in character, Clay, and really try to nail him about that, I'm in danger of him walking away from the conversation, which has happened.
just once. I think, David, that this is such a hard thing, and I don't want us to get drawn into it today either, but on the one hand, slavery has overwhelmed the discourse on Thomas Jefferson, and it should. It's a very complex problem. He doesn't emerge from it with much honor or integrity. It's deeply sad. It's tragic that this great man had this terrible complicity, and although he rattled around in it and squirmed some, he just really didn't have the wherewithal to give his mighty energies to it. And even if he had, he might not have prevailed. But he could have done some personal things that he simply didn't, and he was addicted to luxury in such a way that perpetuated the world of slavery at Monticello. So on the one hand, this subject deserves to bite and overwhelm Jefferson, and frankly, that's why we're moving sort of towards listening to America, to detach ourselves just a little bit from that. And on the other hand, we can't let that completely dissolve or erase Thomas Jefferson, that he's so interesting and so important in so many ways that it would be madness. I believe it would be national insanity for us to erase Jefferson or try to erase Jefferson. It's a form of national suicide to do such a thing, because here's the man who envisioned the American dream. He wrote the most important words in our history. He helped to create our systems. He helped to create the mode of our presidency. At the University of Virginia, he created the campus, the academical village. In so many ways, Jefferson is laying the groundwork for American life. The neoclassical architecture of our state capitals, all but 5 states, is Jeffersonian. His influence and his importance as a creative artist is overwhelming. The way he privileged the agrarian, and we still do. We still privilege the family farmer because of Jefferson's deep commitment to family agriculture. So how do you keep it in balance? So just to quickly wrap this up by taking the University of Virginia, it's a stunning campus. It's maybe the most beautiful campus in the country, certainly one of the top 5. He designed it. He created the curriculum. He helped to hire the first professors. He helped to choose the books for the library. The capstone was the rotunda, which is this magnificent replica in miniature of the Pantheon at Rome. And yet, we know that every brick was baked by an enslaved man or woman, that the grounds were leveled by enslaved people, that the timbers were cut by enslaved people, that the janitors and the cooks and the maids and the groundskeepers were all enslaved people. And so this is like the paradox in miniature. You go there and you think, this is a breathtakingly beautiful monument to the genius of this man. And yet it was made possible by forced labor of a people who were enslaved on the basis of their race alone, and the chances that they would not live and spend their whole lives in slavery approach zero. And we all know that slavery could only be held together with violence and the threat of violence, and that this is an injustice that is just so palpable that no American person can, or no person in the world, can fail to realize how fundamentally corrupt this is. And so there's your paradox. So when people say, why don't you address this question? My view is, when don't we address this question? We always address this question because you have to. And I don't even mind. I mean, I don't mind addressing it. It's important. I think it's essential. But on the other hand, I don't want it to become 52 times a year that we talk about slavery, because then we may as well not do the program. If slavery is the only subject, if it's the overwhelming subject, then we should stop, because that's not what Jefferson was, and
Well, he was
that's not all he was. Let's say that.
better. It was really good to talk a bit with Mr. Jefferson this week about banning books, and I'm sure you would have a lot to say about that as well. But he answered a letter from Reed Schuler about rights versus responsibility. And there's one other email that I really wanted to share with you. It came from Lois Riggins, and she writes, I'm 72 years old. For most of my life, I have believed that the Constitution was a marvelous document that kept our democracy on track. About 4 years ago, I began to realize that our Constitution was insufficient to protect our democracy. Our Constitution works when there are sufficient number of leaders and officials who act with integrity and goodwill. When people put the welfare of the country ahead of personal gain. When leaders are willing to destroy our democracy to hold on to power, we're in trouble. Great letter. Thank you, Lois.
Absolutely right, Lois, that we call these the norms, that there are certain responsibilities and norms that are not codified in the Constitution, but which are essential to the life of a republic. And it only works if you have a Commonwealth understanding. You don't have to have a great Commonwealth understanding. You don't have to be somebody straight out of a civics course, but you have to have the basic instincts of decency. And so these norms have been in place all the way back to the cabinet and the presidency of George Washington. And almost every American political figure has in the end accepted the norms. But the norms are not enforceable. That's what we have learned. The norms are not enforceable because they're not codified in actual language in the Constitution.
I thank Lois for that letter, and we appreciate that so much. We also talked with President Jefferson, as I just mentioned, about books and book banning. And he didn't really come down hard on, no, you should never. But he gave his reasoning, which is what I expected, and it was great to hear. I thought you might want to add to that, I thought.
First of all, of course, I'm very alarmed by the way the violence and the verbal abuse that's taking place at these school board meetings around the country, the loss of civility and the violations of the process by the loudest and most angry citizens is really very upsetting. And as you know, people are leaving school boards or refusing to run for school board or city council or county commission now because of the sheer level of abuse that they're getting from angry citizens. And so this is part of the collapse that we're in. But on the other hand, David, if I'm a conservative Christian parent and my child comes home and the teachers are talking about things that I think are really very private things, I may be upset with that school. I was letting Jefferson be Jefferson today, but I too have some concerns about this because education is such a intimate business, and I personally, having watched my child be educated in our system, have very limited. I don't have unlimited respect for the so-called experts on what a curriculum should be. This is a difficult one. I've been writing a little bit about it in governing.com, and I urge our listeners to go to Governing. I write a Sunday article. I wrote one on Salman Rushdie, the Anglo-Indian novelist who had the fatwa for his book, The Satanic Verses, and was recently severely injured at Chautauqua, New York. by an Islamic extremist of some sort. This is a real danger. But what we're learning is that fundamentalists, and the fundamentalists are those who issued the fatwa against Rushdie and the fundamentalists who turn up at a school board meeting in Omaha, they are not rational beings. They're extremists. That's what fundamentalism is. And so they're using their extremist views to say, I don't want to be in a debate about this. I'm telling you what's going to happen. I'm telling you what I cannot tolerate, and I'm willing to up the ante, including violence if necessary, to achieve my aims. This is a sign of the times that we're in. The cheerful statement attributed to Voltaire, Madam, I disagree with what you say, but I shall defend to the death your right to say it. That all seems quaintly in the past to us now. And I just really deplore that. I think that young people are smart. They know nonsense from good sense. They're more discriminating in many respects than their parents. I trust children to ingest a range of ideas and to know which ones to embrace and which ones to reject. But I do think that teachers, and there are some of them who proselytize from the front of the room, are advocates for a certain culture politics, are bad teachers.
This goes back to that letter from Reed Schuler that I presented to Jefferson about such a concern over citizens' rights rather than their responsibilities. Essentially, what we're talking about is parental responsibilities when it comes to children. But, I would caution those who want to ban books, careful what you wish for, because once that door is open, they may ban books that bother you. I'm struggling in how to say that correctly, but it won't just stop at what those who advocate for the banning of books. It would spread, or am I being naive?
No, this is the whole question of who the guardian is. So I don't trust anybody to decide which books to read and which books not to read, period. I think that it is I hate to use the cliche, but it is a slippery slope. Once you go down that path, then you're going to have the shaping of the truth by whom? Politicians? Fundamentalists? People who listen to Fox or MSNBC and get a notion? People who don't do any investigation but simply fly off the handle because they have some sort of instinct that something bad somewhere is happening. I'll close with this. I know we're out of time. If everybody who is against critical race theory would have to define it, there'd be a lot of silence in this country because people don't know what they're talking about, and yet they are extremely loud and angry about it. We should know what we're talking about. That's the core of the Jeffersonian. I just want to say as we close, David, first of all, thanks to you and to all of our listeners. We love getting questions from them. But when we started with the letter about Delaware and Maryland and the ripening of the crops.
Yes, from Adam Hoffman.
Yeah, I just read yesterday that Ukraine feeds 500 million people. That the grains of Ukraine, which is the Great Plains of Europe, the breadbasket of Europe, that they feed 500 million people, and now they can't because of the war, which has shut down the ports. Some of them are reopening now. But there's a worldwide food shortage, and of course everyone knows spike in food prices because of the Ukraine war. And when I heard that 500 million people are fed by the fields of Ukraine, I was just stunned to think that how it works.
It's not going to matter too much what's in your library if you can't feed your family.
Just the world. We thought that the world was impregnable to famine and pestilence and war, all those great things said by Yuval Harari and Homo Deus. Turns out that the world is still a very vulnerable place, and it takes a man like Vladimir Putin to disrupt a grain-producing country. Whatever else Ukraine is, it is a grain-producing country, and in doing so has created a worldwide food crisis that may lead to actual starvation in some instances. And it seems like a very Jeffersonian point that food is the centerpiece of life, and that farmers, including North Dakota farmers, are the ones that are producing it for the rest of us, and we are all dependent on that now. Jefferson wanted you, David, to be able to feed yourself, which you somewhat can, and everyone to be able to feed themselves, which we don't. And to become dependent in this way really reminds you of the fragility of life, and I think we're in an era where the fragility of life is really coming home to us every single day. So thanks to Adam Hoffman for that great letter about abundance in Delaware and Maryland. So thanks. We'll see you all next week for another important edition of Listening to America, also known as the Thomas Jefferson Hour.
The Thomas Jefferson Hour is brought to you each week by Dakota Sky Education. The program is distributed nationally by Prairie Public. President Thomas Jefferson lived from 1743 to 1826, and this program presents his views. President Jefferson is portrayed by the award-winning humanities scholar and author Clay S. Jenkinson. This program is also available online at jeffersonhour.com and on Apple Podcasts. If you'd like to correspond with President Jefferson or submit a question for him to answer on the program, please visit the website at jeffersonhour.com. The Thomas Jefferson Hour is produced at Makoche Recording Studios in Bismarck, North Dakota. Bach Cello Suite No. 3 in C Major by Stephen Swinford. Thank you for listening. Please tune in again next week for another thought-provoking, historically accurate program through the eyes of Thomas Jefferson.